morning. Open your Bibles, if you would, and put your bookmark in Galatians chapter 6. That's where I'd like to study in our class this morning. And after you put your bookmark there, we're actually going to begin in Genesis chapter 1. So bookmark in Galatians 6, and then flip over to Genesis chapter 1. It's good to see you this morning. I am grateful for the invitation to be here. It is, to me, always an honor to be asked to go speak somewhere, and I appreciate that honor. I trust that our efforts this week will be of some profit to you. Most of you I don't know. A few of you I've met here and there. A number of you know my dad. D is my father, and so if you want to throw stones, just wait till after. And you're more than welcome to do that. Several of you have mentioned him fondly, and I appreciate that. He has preached in this part of the world a good bit through the years, and he sends his greetings to all of you. So I live in Bowman, just a kind of an introduction right quick. I work with the Northwest Church. We have been there since 93, and then I was in Texarkana for 8 years before that, so I know a little about this part of the world. I have preached around Sulphur Springs and Mount Pleasant, but this is as far west as I've gotten down Interstate 30, so I'm glad to be with you. My wife is Tracy. I have 3 daughters, which is why I have no hair. If I had had a full head of hair when we married, which I didn't, but if I had it, I would have lost it. After daughter number 2, daughter number 3 would have been icing on the cake. So they are 26, 21, and 20 by the time this year ends. And so they're all home right now from college. One of them is living with us. And so if I seem a little frazzled, you'll understand why. The nest emptied, and then they all came back home. And I understand that that's the way that goes. And so you have young available men. I've got 2 that are one serious and 2 that are unavailable, and I am looking to get rid of them. They are wonderful. They've been a blessing in our life. And so at any rate, that gives you just a little bit of introduction. I, again, am grateful to be here. This is Bible class, and so I want to invite you to feel free if you have comments to make as we study this morning. Please don't hesitate to do so. You're not going to offend me. We're all here to learn together. And so as we go through this discussion this morning in class, please feel free to participate in that. I want you to notice something in Genesis chapter 1. We are a people given to consistency. Now, even the most spontaneous and inconsistent among us, we tend to fall into patterns, and we like the world to work in a certain way, and it does so by God's design, and we appreciate that. A little storm came through yesterday, little storm, big storm. I grew up in Lubbock, and so that was just kind of a so-so storm, and y'all know what that's like. But, you know, a storm comes through, the power goes out, and you would think that for 4,000, 6,000 years, mankind just couldn't get along without electricity. The power goes out, our world turns upside down. We get used to things being a certain way. We get up in the morning, we probably go through the same pattern. You go put on the coffee, you go take a shower, you shave, you go drink your coffee. You go to work, you go through a sequence of events probably. The reality is we are just given to a kind of a consistent life, and when that's thrown upside down, we don't always know what to do with it. My youngest daughter, who's a freshman in college, was last year, called me one morning and said, "Dad, the power's out in the dorm." She was in Tampa, Florida, and I was in Bowman. I told her, "So baby, I'm 1,000 miles away." You know, but we just don't like when things aren't consistent. Do you know why we're that way? Genesis chapter 1. I want you to notice a little pattern that is revealed here. As Moses tells us about the creation, I want you to notice first of all down in verse 11. God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit, according to its kind." If you take notes in your Bible, you might want to underline that phrase, because it shows up again in the next verse. The earth that brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed, according to its kind, the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself, according to its kind. Get down to verse 20. "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind. Every winged bird, according to its kind. Verse 24, let the earth bring forth a living creature, according to its kind. Cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind. Cattle according to its kind. Everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. I haven't counted, but what is that, 6, 8 times that God offers that phrase. Now, it can mean a couple of things. I think first and foremost, it means that God created everything in its already appropriate divisions. Most of us do not believe in macroevolution, that is, evolution from one species to another, and the Bible tells us that God created everything already designated in its species, and that's part of what that means. But I want to propose to you, it also addresses that God created everything to produce consistently. If you're raising cattle and you breed cattle, what do you expect to get by breeding cattle? Cows. Okay, you've got an issue. Okay, if you're looking for horses out of cow. If you're raising tomatoes, you plant tomato seeds, what do you expect to grow? Tomato seeds. Weeds. Man, this is a tough room already. Okay, remember what I said about participating? Just forget that. And we live in a world that's designed that way. You see it here. God makes the point right here, but you see it not only in regards to the animal world and the vegetable world, you see it in everything. Electricity is governed by certain principles. Chemistry is governed by certain principles. The physical universe is governed by certain principles. And the interesting thing about evolution to me, and everything that is involved with evolutionary theory, is it doesn't recognize that we live in a world that's very, very consistent. And yet the whole premise of evolution is things change. Well, why is it that electricity doesn't change? Why is it that you add sodium and chloride, you get salt? Why doesn't that change? Why doesn't everything change? Well, because God made it that way. And we rely on it. We count on it. We live in accordance with it. We farm, we ranch, we work. And we use all these principles that God has given us, and we understand that it's a very consistent world. Okay, now flip over to Galatians chapter 6, and I want you to see why I have tried to introduce that thought. In Galatians chapter 6, there is a fairly common, well-known section here where Paul is making some practical applications to these churches as he has been discussing really the things that are dividing them. The whole book of Galatians is about Judaizing teachers and the influence of Judaism upon early Christians. And the practical way that impacted them was that it divided them. It caused biases and discrimination and problems within those congregations. And you read through Galatians, I think it kind of comes to a point when he says in verse 14 of chapter 5, all the law is fulfilled in one word, love your neighbor as yourself, but if you divide and devour one another, take heed. So you get to chapter 6 and he starts saying things like, somebody's overtaken a fault. If you're spiritually minded, you restore that person. And he doesn't say if he's a Jew and you're a Jew, he just says you restore that person. You bear one another's burdens. He makes all these practical applications about how we are supposed to live with one another as children of God. And when he gets to verse 7, the verses 7 and 8 is what I really want to focus on, he makes this admonition. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. There's the principle from Genesis 1. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. He that sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. In the context, his point is how you act towards one another in your dealings with one another is going to have eternal implications. You can't live the way you're living and despise and devour and hate one another because of your background and expect to stand faithful before God. That's the point in the context. I want to back out of that a little bit and make some general applications of this passage because I think it's important for us. I think it's important for us to give some thought to how we're living our lives in accordance with the principles of sowing and reaping. And so, looking at verse 7 and 8, I want you to notice the first point of instruction from those two verses. What would you guess is the first point of instruction in verse 7 and 8? What's the first thing he tells them? Don't be deceived. Why do you think God would tell us, don't be deceived?
Because the devil's out there.
Yeah, because we are being lied to. And the devil's lying to us, but I tell you who's worse about deceiving us than the devil. Say that out loud. Ourselves. Self-deception is an issue that every Christian, if we're really going to serve the Lord faithfully, we have to deal with this. And I think that's his point when he says don't be deceived. I don't think it's so much that someone outside of you, he may be addressing this in regards to the Judaizing teachers, but I think as much as anything else in the context, he wants them to do some reflection about themselves. And I must tell you, we're pretty good at seeing what we want to see. There are several of you guys here. I don't want to offend anybody. Those of you who are bald, how old were you when you started losing your hair? And I'll jump in first. When I was 18 years old, back in the 70s, okay, this is the 70s, long blonde hair and a bunch of it, parted down the middle and feathered. Oh, it was gorgeous. When I was 20, I looked almost like I look now. Okay? Yeah, 2 years. And it just all, what didn't turn gray turned loose. Okay? How old were you when you started losing your hair? 20s? Nobody else is going to say anything, are you? Okay. You know, I was the first one out there. When you started losing your hair, did you embrace it? No. No, you do the Buck Owens thing. You know, you let it grow way down on one side, and you comb it over and whirl it around, you let it get ready. So, you know, why? Why do we do that kind of stuff? We don't want to admit what's happening to us. And we do that with a lot of things. We're not always very honest with our lives. And you see it very obviously in the physical realm. If you've ever gone on a diet, you go on a diet and after 3 days of starvation, and you think you're going to die, you stand in front of the mirror, you pull in your belly, you go, hey honey, look at this. Man, I had to have lost 5-10 pounds already. No, you didn't lose 5 or 10 pounds. You're sucking in your belly, you look just like you did before. It's going to take longer than that. But when we look in the mirror, we see kind of what we want to see. And we're that way about so many things in our life. Honesty is very, very difficult. To admit our weaknesses, our inabilities, our issues. We know what they are. We just don't always like to admit them. And I think that's especially true when it comes to serving God. I'm not going to ask you to list them, but could you list the areas where you're really deficient in your service? I think part of the reason that this is hard for us is because we kind of pick and choose our standards. If you back up in Galatians 6, I want you to notice that in verse 3, he's already made this admonition once. If anyone thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. If you go over to James chapter 1, be doers of the word and not hearers only. What's the rest of that verse? Anybody? Take a guess given the context of what we're talking about. Okay. James chapter 1. Turn over there and read it. And then next time you'll know the answer to this question. Okay. James chapter 1. Look at verses, starting in verse 22. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. Somebody read it. Deceiving yourselves. If anyone's a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing his natural face in a glass. He observes himself, he goes away, immediately forgets what kind of man that he was. He who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer but a doer of the word, this one will be blessed in his deed. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives himself, that this one's religion is useless. Why do you think God offers this kind of, hey, you need to not deceive yourself about doing and hearing. You need to not deceive yourself about who you are. You need to not deceive yourself about sowing and reaping. Well, I think it's because we're pretty good at seeing ourselves the way we want to. How do you measure faithfulness? this congregation, have never preached here before, never even visited in this building. If I were to ask you, okay, here's so-and-so walks into the building. Is he faithful? What standards would you use to answer that question? He's faithful because...
So many times we base it on whether or not they're here at every time the doors open.
Okay, attendance?
But that doesn't have anything to do with real life.
No, you're right. But what I'm asking is, how do we tend to measure faithfulness? By our standards. Attendance, what else? Is that it?
By other people in the world.
Okay, how they compare, you mean what, morally? How they compare morally with other people in the world? Anybody else? Any other standards that you would use?
Bible knowledge.
By the Bible knowledge, okay? So let's take somebody who's here at every service. He's a moral man. He's not out drinking and dancing and committing adultery. He's not cussing and lying and cheating and stealing. And he knows a lot about the Bible. Is that man faithful to the Lord? Yes, it is a loaded question. In some ways, but not necessarily, correct? And yet, we tend to say, okay, this guy's faithful because we're really bad about that with ourselves. And among our brethren, I think it's especially been a challenge through the years because we tend to place a great premium upon what we teach. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But very often we'll put more emphasis upon doctrine than we do, say, on character. Oh, he's got the right position on the marriage question. He is someone who stands up for the truth on institutionalism. He's not going to misuse the funds of the treasury. Here's a person that, when it comes to premillennialism, he understands what the Bible says. And yet, what if that same person's impatient, lacking in self-control, not very kind, doesn't give much attention to his brethren? You know, those are standards. In fact, those are standards in Galatians if you back up into the fruit of the Spirit in chapter 5. Those are standards that God uses. And what I want you to see about this is, it's really easy for us to look at ourselves and say, I'm faithful to the Lord because of this, and this. And so, everything's okay. I don't have to work at it too much harder. I've got a handle on what I'm supposed to be doing as a Christian. And so, I am faithful to God. And yet, the instruction in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 is, don't be deceived. Okay, and he offers two good reasons that we shouldn't be deceived. The first one is that God is not mocked. Now, what in the world does that have to do with self-deception? And he's using this word in a way we rarely use it. When we think of mocking someone, what do you think of? Teasing, making fun of. It's the little kid in school with the big glasses, or that's a little overweight, or teeth are crooked, and the other kids make fun of them. And the reason they make fun of them is because we look at those kinds of things, and we think they make that person less than us. That's bad about kids. Even adults, we tend in this regard. And it makes us feel somehow or the other better by putting them down. That's the way we use the word mock. But that's not what Paul's saying here. Okay? Although the concept is related. But the reality is we make fun of that which we look down upon. We treat with contempt. And that's the concept here. Don't deceive yourself. Don't be deceived. Why? Because God is not going to be treated with contempt. You think, well, how would self-deception treat God with contempt? How does God measure us? Use a biblical example, if you would. How does God measure you and I?
We love our neighbors.
Okay? Love our neighbors ourselves. But think of something more general. Think of the principle as opposed to the applications. You remember when God sent Samuel to anoint David as king? Yes? Okay, we've got to establish this first off this week. I use a lot of rhetorical questions that aren't really rhetorical, and I need yes or no. If you don't do that, I'll just keep, Brady told me I got to finish it, what time, 11:35 this morning. If you don't yes or no, we'll be here 2, 3 o'clock this afternoon. Okay? So, do you remember when God sent Samuel to anoint David as king? Yes. Okay? And Samuel goes to Jesse's house, and David's older brothers, the oldest 3 of them are in Saul's army, which means they're grown men, they're strong men. And Samuel looks at them, and the last time he anointed somebody king, it was Saul, and Saul was head and shoulders bigger than everybody else. And so he sees Eliab, and he says, surely the Lord's anointed this before. Surely this is the guy God's picking next. And God told him, no, don't look at what? Because God looks at the heart. So when God's looking at you and I, and measuring us up, is He looking only at our attendance or our Bible knowledge or our morality? What's He looking at? He's looking at what we're thinking. And what our intentions are, and what our will is, and what our determination is, and where our real trust is. Now, all of those things have to be expressed. I'm not denying that. But God's looking at a lot more than the standards that we sometimes choose. And if I know God's looking at my heart, but I'm looking at myself going, I'm okay with God, because I'm at every service. I'm okay with God because I can quote Scripture frontwards and backwards. I'm okay with God because I'm a moral person. And yet I know there are areas in my life that I don't particularly work on. I'm not a very good husband. I'm not a very good wife. I don't really try to bring my children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. I don't participate in the local congregation the way that I ought to. I don't work on my patience and self-control and brotherly love and kindness and goodness. And I know I don't work on those things. But I content myself with the things I do well. What am I doing to God? I'm treating His standard with contempt. I am mocking God. Now I doubt very seriously that any of us look at that and go, I do not want to mock God. Now, I mean, the reality is, if you thought of yourself poking fun at God, can you think of anything more reprehensible? And yet, what Paul's reminding us of is that if you deceive yourself, you're mocking God. And the other reason he gives for, do not be deceived, God is not mocked for what? Look back at verse 7. Why else should we not be deceived?
Whatever a man sows, that's what he'll reap.
Because you're going to get what you plant. And now we're back to Genesis chapter 1 and a principle that we all understand. Okay? Which should tell us something, folks. You know, if the Lord came this afternoon, the next storm that rolled in was preceded by the archangel's trumpet, and the Lord came this afternoon, we ought to know exactly what's going to happen to us. And if you're not sure about what's happening to you and going to happen to you on the day of judgment, maybe you have some soul searching to do about what you're planting and what you're expecting to reap. And so, this first admonition, I think, is very serious. It's not a comfortable thing for us. Very, very little that God tells us about ourselves is comfortable. We like the comfortable stuff. But what Paul tells these brethren, and what we need to see if we're really going to be faithful to the Lord, is we can't deceive ourselves about our service. We can't mock God, and we're going to get what we plant. Okay, so that's point number 1. Questions, comments, suggestions? Okay. Number 2, I want you to look at verse 8. And I want you to notice that he underscores the principle that we've already established, that he that sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, he that sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And his point here is not so much to help us understand you're going to get what you plant. His point here is to help us understand the seriousness of the consequence. Okay? He's already told us in verse 6, you're going to, whatever you sow, you're going to reap. The point here is, if you sow this, this is what you're going to get. If you sow this, this is what you're going to get. So let's look at those things right quick. Sowing to the flesh is the first thing he mentions. He that sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. If you look at the context and you go back into chapter 5, Paul's already introduced this idea. Back we already read verses 15 and 16, or 14 and 15. If you bite and devour one another, take heed lest you be consumed. I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. The flesh lusts against the Spirit against the flesh. These are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. If you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. The works of the flesh are evident. And we're familiar with this passage. All these things that constitute ungodliness. So a few verses later when he says, and remember he didn't stop at chapter 6 and say, okay, chapter 6 verse 1, let's change our thing. This is all one letter. The context hasn't changed. When he says whoever sows to the flesh, he's already brought up what it means to sow to the flesh. And the idea that he offers at the end of chapter 5 is adultery, fornication, uncleanness, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envies, murder, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. And we look at that and go, man, the world is full of that mess. So is the church. We all deal with something on this list, don't we? And the point that I think needs to be made about that is I've got to deal with that. We're going to talk tomorrow night about our salvation, about faith and works from Romans. And I do believe that on the day of judgment, what's going to happen is that everybody's going to be saved. They're going to be sinners, and they're going to be guilty, and they're going to be forgiven, and God's going to treat them with mercy. But I don't think that we need to flaunt that. The reality is, when we obey the gospel of Jesus Christ and God forgives our sins, we make a commitment to become disciples and to start dealing with our sin. Dealing with our flesh, as he puts it in this context. And that's my job. I cannot serve God faithfully and expect God to just windshield wipe my sin, and I'm just going to keep on sinning. I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to address it. But God promises me mercy. I mean, you see that concept in Romans chapter 6 when Paul asks the question, if we're saved by grace, should we sin the more that grace may abound? Well, God forbid that we would do that. Well, I want you to see here the point that he initially makes is, we can't claim to be followers of Jesus Christ if we're not dealing with our sin. You sow to the flesh. Of the flesh, you're going to reap corruption. And it doesn't matter what your sin is, if it's big, if it's little, we've got to deal with it. We've got to work on it. We've got to become dead to it. And I suspect most of us are. I hope you are. If not, here's your admonition to do so. I think the greater problem is another sowing to the flesh that I know I struggle with. I struggle with bad. And that is the concept of just temporality, just becoming consumed with the here and the now. You know, in 1 John chapter 2, John tells us not to love the things of the world. And all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life. It's not of the Father, but it's of the world. And not everything that we desire in the flesh or by the eye is in and of itself sinful. Look at Luke chapter 14. There's a parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 14 about a man that gives a great feast. And he's already sent the invitations out, and people know they're invited. When it comes time for the feast, he sends his servants to bring the guests. You remember how the parable goes? They all begin to do what? Make excuses about not coming. And what are the excuses? You remember?
Married a wife.
Okay, one guy, he's got the best excuse, by the way. Okay, I have taken a wife. Notice that's all he has to say. I find that interesting. I do believe the Lord had a sense of humor, and I think that's one of them right there. I have taken a wife. I can't come. And is there anything wrong with being married? God instituted it. What are the other excuses in the parable?
Piece of land.
Okay, I bought a piece of land and I need to go see it. How much sense does that make? Would you buy a piece of land you haven't seen? Huh? Would you? I mean, think this through. Jesus is offering this in a certain way because it helps us to understand the ridiculousness of the excuses. I bought a piece of land I haven't even looked at. Would you do that? No. What does that tell us? This is an excuse. Okay, what about the next guy? About 5 yoke of oxen, I have to do what? Test them. We don't buy oxen. We don't run oxen. We buy a tractor. Would you go buy a tractor sight unseen that you've never been on, never tested? Nope. And the point of all that is these are clearly excuses. And the master becomes angry because these men are offering excuses. They don't want to come. And so they find reasons not to come. And let me ask you something. Is it a sin to take a wife? No. Is it a sin to buy property? No. Is it a sin to buy whatever you need to work your land? No. These are not sinful things. The problem and the reason that the master becomes angry is, and obviously the master is God, is because what should be a priority, the feast that the master is giving, it is secondary to things that don't have any lasting value. And that's the reason Jesus tells the parable. And I must tell you folks, that's my struggle. It's probably your struggle too. It's very easy in this world to sow to the flesh in the sense that we're just consumed with this life and the here and the now. We're consumed with our family. We're consumed with our job. We're consumed with our education. We're consumed with our hobbies. We're consumed with our golf or our hunting or our fishing. We're consumed with buying stuff. We're consumed with things that aren't in and of themselves sinful. But they become our priorities. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul writes to those brethren, if you're risen with Christ, seek those things that are what? Above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. And I really do believe that one of the big problems that Christians have in this day and age in this country is we're just consumed with living. We live a good life, we live a comfortable life. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, so if you're uncomfortable now, get ready. You're going to get more uncomfortable before the morning's over. But that is a detriment to us. And I'll make the application that you're really not going to like. We're about to have a meeting this week, and I don't care who's up here. I don't care if it's me or Brady, the greatest preacher in the world or the worst preacher in the world. Y'all have decided we're going to get together for a few days this week, and we're going to try to build each other up and make some progress and maybe get some folks in to visit. We're going to have a gospel meeting. But how many of us are going to miss for stuff that has no eternal value? 2 of my girls played soccer. 2 of them were in the band. When they were young, when they were in high school, 2 of them are only a year apart. We were going and going and going and going. And here we are. They're all out of high school now. And none of that means anything. Anything. And I watch people every day who are consumed with their kids' ball, are consumed with their kids' activities, are consumed with their job, are consumed with their fishing. And on the day of judgment, God's not going to ask you what your high school football record was, or how many wins you had on the pitcher's mound, or what your RBI was, or what's the biggest fish you ever caught, or how did you do with your retirement plan. None of those things are going to matter. Our problem is not so much sin as it is temporality. And we need to deal with that. We need to think about it. I don't mean to start off the week making you mad. But if it makes you mad and it saves your soul, then so be it. Because the book says what the book says. Those who sow to the flesh, he says, and here's the point, will of the flesh reap corruption. I wish I understood everything that this means. Some people think that this means, well, the way of the unfaithful, Psalm 13:15, the way of the unfaithful is hard. That you live a life of ungodliness, that you're going to have all kinds of consequences. I do think that's true, but I'm not sure that's the point here. I want you to notice the contrast. If you look at Galatians 6 and verse 8, what does he contrast corruption to? If you sow to the flesh, of the flesh you'll reap corruption. What's the contrast? Okay, everlasting life. Okay, you sow the Spirit, of the Spirit reap everlasting life. So I think the way to understand this is, whatever it means, it's in contrast to everlasting life. And I would propose, and this is my opinion, okay, I can't prove it, this is what I think the passage means. That what we face if we give ourselves to just this life, to sowing to the flesh, is that in eternity, whatever condemnation is going to be. John chapter 5, Jesus talks about the judgment day and being raised to eternal life or being raised to eternal condemnation. Well, what does that mean? Well, we know what eternal life involves: a resurrected body, a glorified body in heaven with God forever. And we know that judgment involves an eternity in hell, but we don't think much about the body. But there's going to be a resurrection of the ungodly as well as of the godly. A resurrection of the just and the unjust. And I would propose, what makes the most sense to me, is that eternal condemnation is going to involve the body as well. A resurrected body that's eternally in the state of decay. The word corruption here is the same word that's used for the decay of the body after death. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus talks about hell in terms of where the worm doesn't die. You remember that passage where the flame is not quenched and the worm doesn't die? Anybody know what that worm refers to? I'm sorry, this is gross, but it is what it is. Maggots. It is what feasts upon dead flesh. Well, why would he use that terminology? Well, it's an Old Testament picture, first of all, but it's also an Old Testament picture of dead bodies that are decaying. From Isaiah 66. And Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 2, talks about eternal condemnation, eternal corruption. And I would propose at least what makes sense in this passage is for those who give their lives to the pursuit of the flesh. And you're not interested in the Spirit, and you're not working towards where you're going to go when you die. What you're going to do is spend eternity in punishment, separated from God, in a body that is constantly in a state of decay. That's what makes the most sense to me. I'm 57, and things are starting to hurt. Okay? I do not want to spend eternity in a body that is decaying as if it were dead. And the point is, you're going to get what you plant. And that's what that planting is going to get you. Now, if you go back to verse 8, the contrast is, he who sows to the Spirit will love the Spirit to reap everlasting life. Brady, did you say 25 back here? 20. Okay. This one I think we understand more. I'm going to make the same comparison. What is sowing to the Spirit? Back up into chapter 5. The context is the fruit of the Spirit. Isn't that interesting? Fruit is what you get after you plant something. The fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. First of all, if we're planting spiritual things, those are the kinds of things that are going to be manifested in our life, and I think that's the primary application. And if those things are manifested in your life, maybe you're not planting spiritually. But I'd make the secondary application as well. Are we seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, which is what we're about to talk about in the sermon? Are we giving ourselves to the pursuit of the other world? Are we helping our kids as much to learn about what happens after baseball, after soccer, after volleyball? You know, once you get past that 18-year-old mark where you go off to college and now you got to live life and you got to confront character and the future and whether or not you're ready and whether you're prepared to serve God. Are we planting spiritual things? Are we thinking in those terms? He said those who are planting spiritual things will love the Spirit, reap everlasting life. And We understand the promise of everlasting life. It's hard to fathom. It's hard. Well, we don't live in a world where people don't die. And yet it has great appeal for us. But it's even more than that. The promise is a resurrected, glorified body where it doesn't decay, it doesn't age, it doesn't fade away. Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Peter chapter 1, over and over and over, God makes this promise about a glorified, everlasting body, made like unto Jesus' body, Philippians 3, 1 John 3. And that's appealing. Who does that not appeal to? How old did you say you were, sister? Tell me your last name again. 93. And I've lost your last name. Curran. I knew it started with a C. Your knees don't work anymore, right? Had to be wheeled in and wheeled out. Does it appeal to you to live forever in a glorified body where nothing ever gets old and nothing ever breaks down? Sure it does. It appeals to all of us. And that is the promise of God, not just the, hey, if you're lucky, of God. So why would you plant stuff that doesn't end up there? And here and now, everybody goes, well, that makes good sense. Tomorrow, when we got to go to job, we got to go to school, we got to deal with life again, it becomes harder. But this is the principle to remember, that we don't deceive ourselves. Now, go back to the text. I've got 5 minutes. I want to make the last point. We didn't read the next two verses, but Paul goes from, don't be deceived, God's not mocked, whatever you sow, you're going to reap. You sow to the flesh, of the flesh you're going to reap corruption. You sow to the Spirit, of the Spirit you're going to reap everlasting life. And his point then is, and let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we will reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Now, let me offer you a good test of where you're planting spiritual things. Are you going about doing good? I recognize that we measure faithfulness by doctrinal things, first and foremost, but the reality is, if those doctrinal things don't result in the way that we act, then they are useless. Jesus is described to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 as one who went about doing good. Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells the parable of judgment, the right hand and the left hand. And what's the difference? I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. Our job, folks, is to go about doing good. As he says in verse 10, as you have opportunity, let's do good to all men. Well, what about I don't trust that guy's sincerity. God doesn't ask us to judge somebody's sincerity. God asks us to do good. And so, let me suggest to you, doing good is planting spiritual things. But here's the challenge. Let us not grow weary in it. Several of you from West Texas, and I've had this conversation with a couple of you. I was born in Lubbock and lived in Slayton and just outside of Lubbock until I was in high school. So that's home to me. West Texas folks are pretty independent, but they also tend to be mannerly. Now, I'm married to a girl from South Alabama. West Texas folks aren't mannerly like South Alabama, where you have to have the right fork for the right thing, okay? But we are mannerly in regards to, you hold open the door for a lady, you tip your hat. Those kinds of terms and indications of respect were very much a part of my growing up. And if I didn't do that, my granddaddy would come back out of the grave and get me. And so I'm going to be the guy that stands there and holds the door open. That's the way I was raised, and that's the way it's just going to be. and every now and then I'm holding the door open for somebody, and some woman, it's always a woman, some woman walks in who acts like I was put on the earth to open that door for her. Just walks on by like nothing, no eye contact, no thank you, no nothing, just like, well, you should have done that because I'm me. And I'll stand there and watch folks with that kind of attitude, that kind of ingratitude, and I just want to kick them as they walk on by. Or just close the door on them. Say, hey, I'm trying to do something nice for you. Okay? Get off your high horse for a minute and recognize there are other people in the world. Now, I'm going to open this door for you again. Let's try this all over. I get sick and tired of the world we live in. I get sick and tired of trying to be nice when people around you aren't. I get sick and tired of trying to be honest when people around you aren't. I get sick and tired of trying to do the right thing when people will take advantage of you right away. And I'll tell you in a heartbeat, I tend to be a pessimist because of the world we live in. And what God tells me is I have no right to quit doing good. We cannot become weary while doing good. Because we're going to reap what we sow. And our job is to make a difference in this world. And our job is to make a difference with one another. And our job, according to Galatians, is to get along and encourage one another and help one another, build each other up, bear each other's burdens, and correct one another if we fall. And to plant spiritual things, because God created the world where everything reaps according to its character. And if we're going to serve the Lord, it is a principle we need to take very, very seriously. So, that's what I've got to say. Questions?